to Immersive Sports Science content documentary, Sports Science Not Bro Science. And in this video we do a sports science review of the documentary Finding Jack Charlton. This is a documentary focusing on him as Ireland manager and later on with his own dementia. This review in particular will look at the documentary but also their social media in terms of their Instagram and the way it's laid out, but that's just a minor part of this review. The documentary and the sports science that's noted inside that documentary is what we are going to focus on today. Now, those who don't know who Jackie Charlton is, Jackie Charlton was part of the famous 1966 World Cup winning squad. He then later entered management and became the manager for the Republic of Ireland. Finding Jackie Charlton, made by the director of The Edge, is a reflexive mode documentary focusing on the life of Jack Charlton. He was a former England football player and Ireland manager, and this particularly focused on his time with Ireland. It also focused upon his Alzheimer's in a non-linear format. It also followed to a lesser extent small parts of his life, like him winning the World Cup and where he came from and him working in a mine, for instance. The main focus of this documentary was his relationship with Ireland and the Irish players of the day. Some of the limitations with this documentary are kind of fixed by the Instagram page, where it expands upon the knowledge in the areas which the documentary couldn't necessarily go into full depth. For instance, his early life and career. To many in Ireland, the signing of an English manager was quite controversial.
I was disappointed, to be honest. After all that's happened in this country, why would we have to have an Englishman of all people to run our soccer team?
Many of the Irish people did not want or found it quite controversial that there would be an English manager at the head of the Republic of Ireland national football team. Now, although many English people do like and will support potentially the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish, inside a competition providing that England aren't still in it. Now, we've got to remember at the time there's a lot of history regarding England and its impact upon Ireland and the impact upon the Troubles itself. Now, I'm not going to go into detail because, well, I don't really know much about that historical context, although I do like history. I personally, on this channel, will not talk about politics, which is exactly what that is. If you are interested in it, I recommend you do your research upon the history. Ireland's biggest export was her people. The fact that I'm talking to you here in Essex as someone who went to a Roman Catholic primary school with a Irish influence, and that my second name is McCarthy, although I do not perceive myself to be Irish, although I do have a potential affinity to this storyline, is actually a testament to that history. Therefore, I am one of the cousins, if you like, from across the pond.
Hello, Mr. Charlton. I'd like to ask you a few questions about soccer. What do you think of the English press saying that you're a bunch of mercenaries playing for money because most of you come from England, Scotland or Wales?
The players playing for the Republic, they don't come for the money, they come because they want to play international football, and they've got relatives who were born here in the Republic, and you've always exported people. You know, it's nice for them to come back and help you out now and again.
What did it mean to you personally, Jack, to lead Ireland to the World Cup finals?
You're talking about financially.
Now, this could be seen, particularly the history of Ireland, in the player of McGrath, a potential sense of cognitive dissonance in his own personality, of how he saw himself.
I was a black kid. I would feel that I was on the outskirts, an outsider, and then had to come back on a boat and pass me over to the nuns. Went to an orphanage till I was 18. I got the shit kicked out of me. If someone calls me a nigger straight to my face, then me and him are going to be fighting, no matter who it is.
He embodied this dysfunctional history of Ireland. There were so few people in Ireland who were black.
I just wanted to be as big as I could so that I could not get beaten up as many times as I did. That's what brought me to football.
Especially with many of the players, some of them not even from Ireland themselves, with completely different accents. But it's interesting to know that McGrath did not see what people saw of him in terms of reflecting Ireland itself.
In the middle of the 1980s, if Ireland were a person, it would have been a deeply dysfunctional, tormented individual.
A team identity is hugely important for team cohesion. This can be developed and trained upon, but it's not something that is easily perceivable, easy to define. And yet, you know of a really cohesive team and a team that really gets along well with each other. Great social efficacy when you see it.
You could touch and feel the spirit of the camp.
And you may be surprised to hear that throughout the research, national identity is often a poor foundation for developing team identity or team cohesion through identity. Now, this is not for the reasons you may be thinking of. And yes, there are examples where developing a strong sense of national identity is very helpful. If you are going to utilise patriotism as a form of your team identity, you need something else alongside in order to create a performance identity and a group ethic in order to meet the tactical and illusory demands and goals placed upon the team.
That time was all about people winning who had never won before.
Whether you were interested in football or not, it didn't matter.
We're going to go for the next stage. I'm going to win the World Cup.
We're going to stick on an Irish jersey. We're going to hoist the flag, and things will never be the same again.
Ireland have finally qualified for the World Cup finals. An historic afternoon in Malta.
What was briefly touched upon and I found quite interesting was the whole team approach adopted by Jack Charlton. This allows for buy-in by every member of the team. If they feel that they are a part of the team and their role is important, they're more likely to do well for the team and to put in more effort.
I was called a kit man, we say. Now, a lot of people would say that's the lowest position you can have in an international team. Not where Jack was concerned. Jack made me very, very important. He always put you there with the players. He was a master of man management. Never saw anyone to equal him.
But as shown with our interview of Ross Shand on the DCEP Northern Applied Hub Talking Site podcast, being just a coach may devalue the position of, let's say, a psychologist. From the sports science, and in this case the performance analysis aspect of this film, is the utilisation of notational analysis. Now, what does that mean? That means literally taking notes. But how do you do notational analysis, and what sets it apart to much newer or much different forms of performance analysis? This single recognised process makes it easier to allow for comparison between observers, players, teams and games, both quantitatively or in this case more likely to be qualitatively. However, what gets measured gets improved, and the things you decide to measure are called performance criteria. This can be based on what an individual player does, or on what team does, or what you could include both for yourself and your team. Other forms of performance analysis is graphical representation, so these are graphs and tables, as well as data analysis, or basically analytics in terms of the computer world. The best performance analysis combines all three main methods. It must be remembered that we utilise performance analysis in order to help, in this case, Jack Charlton to select the team, select the tactics that will work best for his own squad. Now, it's interesting then to state that Ireland were utilising very much different tactics to the rest of the world were utilising. And one of the reasons that dictated their tactics within their games was the fact that, well, they weren't really that good, to be honest. Yes, they had some great players, but as a team they weren't good, so they needed to have the tactics that would support the players they had in their base. One for the Delio, there's whiskey in the jar. One of these notable differences in the way he chose his team is that particularly Jack Charlton was interested in centre-backs who were better defenders than what they were necessarily going forward. He didn't want creative players in terms of his centre-backs or his defenders primarily. He was old school. He wanted players that prevented the opposition from playing. And if it just happens to so that Martin O'Leary, who turns out to be really good for the team, is a creative player but can take out the other opponent, oh, that's a bonus. There was also an interesting part about penalty shootouts. You can see my video series, which I'm still yet to complete, on penalty shootouts here. Penalty shootouts are psychologically very draining. They take a lot of mental fortitude and resilience. As a fact, there's a lot of mind games being played also. Goalkeepers do not have much chance in ever saving the ball, only around about 30% depending on when the ball is placed. Yes, they can do certain things that help prevent or lessen that chance of the opponent scoring. But for the most part, as a goalkeeper, you are trying to take control of the game, take control of that situation away from the ball striker, from the penalty taker. As a penalty taker, you are looking to maintain that control and be confident in your own technique. Yes, I do understand that at times some people make a brilliant save because of whatever situation, whatever they managed to read from the penalty taker beforehand, as well as getting, as what we do now, taking information about those penalty takers beforehand to give that goalkeeper a chance of saving the ball. Now, the greatest chance of scoring are in the bottom corners, but also you have a far greater chance of, if you actually hit the target, in the top corners. Generally, it's more of a 40-50 split if you strike down the centre. That's not generally a good place to place the ball. However, goalkeepers generally do get a tendency after a while to dive to side. So that kind of evens up those chances if you hit it down the centre. Yet again, you look like an absolute idiot if you don't move and the ball strikes either side as a goalkeeper, and you look like an idiot if the goalkeeper stands there and you hit it straight towards them. Goalkeepers' penalty save rates aren't that good either. The best penalty saving goalkeepers in the world will have around about a 30 to 40% chance of actually saving the ball. Not only researching your penalty taker is also beneficial, which they didn't particularly do in these days. There wasn't much coverage of the players themselves. However, when you reach the elite level, the top tiers of European football, there's going to be a little bit of footage around that. Do you have access to that footage? Especially around the 1980s, 1990s, when Jack Charlton was manager of the Republic of Ireland. As a goalkeeper, what you can do is stand off-centre, depending where you want that player to strike, or potentially where you don't want them to strike. By standing off-centre, you give yourself a chance of saving the ball. You can also move across the line potentially to, if you like, go the penalty taker into shooting a particular direction. But understanding where they're likely to shoot in that direction, you can take a calculated risk. Because as a goalkeeper, you don't have much time to save the ball. The ball's coming towards you at almost less than a second. It's already reached halfway towards you. Even if you do dive the right direction and you do have the same length, if you don't move before the ball's being struck, then you're unlikely to save the ball, especially if that ball's been placed in towards the bottom or top corners. Making yourself look big or small can also help in goading the player to shoot closer towards the goalkeeper or even further away from the goalkeeper. That can be a bit of a risk because it might, if you try and make yourself look small, you might encourage the player to shoot actually into the corner subconsciously rather than towards you. Likewise, if you're too big, you can force them to shoot wider than necessary, causing them to miss. But it also gives you a greater chance of moving to the side by taking a bigger step in order to help save that ball. There's loads of different nuances as a goalkeeper that you can do. As a penalty shooter, pick your direction and stick with it. But you have to know whether you are goalkeeper dependent or whether you're goalkeeper independent, meaning you rely on the goalkeeper to make the move first before you shoot. You've only got a small time to think, and some ways are better than others. So, because someone stutters into the ball does not mean they're goalkeeper dependent. It might be just as a ruse to get the goalkeeper to move, to put them off. Exactly what the goalkeeper's doing when they are moving across the line. There's also pressure placed upon the athlete themselves. When you're surrounded by thousands around the stadium and millions, if not billions, watching worldwide.
I look behind the goal. Grown men with the fear of God in them.
How are you going to react? Football is a team game, but in this situation, you're an individual. It's about being calm, about being collected in that situation. Some people love the idea of being individual, having all that glory, potentially for themselves. Those situations you dream of when you're a youngster. Other people don't like it. They like to be in the team and get the team to win and doing their part within that team to help them to win. Ultimately, to be good at penalties, it's being confident. And sometimes it's about showing confidence even when you're not.
I'd taken no penalties before in my career.
It was just so quiet.
Can decide it all.
And then the whole hell broke loose, didn't it?
The nation holds its breath. Yes!
But likewise, guys, if you want a greater depth of information about penalty takers, definitely click the card above regarding my playlist on penalty shootouts and the science behind them. Some people utilise fear and anxiety in different ways. Anxiety is not helpful towards performance necessarily, but being confident is, and this links on to arousal. Arousal. So what we have, if you like, is this inverted U. It's called inverted U theory. So we get to an optimum point of arousal, and then you drop down the other side. This can lead into anxiety. Now, anxiety has its own inverted U, but this is too basic because we know that some people are able to reframe the situation and utilize their anxiety as a way of helping them to perform. Yes, it is a negative emotion, but when reframed, can be potentially positive, and that's can be. And now there's two potential philosophies on the idea. You've got the North American theory, which is that anxiety is negatively bad and we should avoid it at all costs. And the European idea, which is a little bit more progressive, is that maybe we could utilize anxiety to help that performance. Yet again, if someone doesn't negatively do well with anxiety, why we bring it into the fold?
Now hit me, come on! Rub it!
I did find it quite amusing in a weird way. I was watching Jackie Charlton trying to teach the young players. It was not what we would call today PC at all. But those were different times then. You can't just call a kid rubbish nowadays because it affects them mentally. And we know the effect of being aggressive towards youngsters, which could mean that less people want to play football. And you might not necessarily get the potential from them. But what Jackie Charlton and the Republic of Ireland football team did was help to promote soccer within Ireland, especially in places that preferred more Gaelic football and other pastimes. This was quite beneficial to that movement within those areas, increasing the player base. The better your players do, the more people are potentially inspired to want to partake in it, or even sometimes even just to get fit and healthy. For instance, many people are inspired by the Olympics knowing that they're not potentially going to be an Olympian because they're 40-year-old and overweight, but they're inspired by the storylines, inspired by the effort those guys put in order to do their sport, and they feel like that maybe they could be motivated enough to be fit and healthy and go to the gym and exercise or do whatever. It's not necessarily related just to sport. People may think, well, that's motivating, I'm going to do sewing or chess or whatever. Sad thing is, familiarity can breed contempt, and especially when you're doing well and you're not doing so well now, or they've lost the love of the manager, well, goodbye, my friend, you've been sacked. In sport, you're paid for your performance. In club football, for instance, you're there not just for your performance, but whether your football's entertaining, potentially. If people see the performances, and if the style you play is very entertaining, that gets more people into the stadium, potentially get more fans, potentially get more viewers worldwide, and that makes money. And what people don't realise is that sport is a business. Your team is not your club. It is your team, and is a football club, but it's a business first and foremost. It can't run on a loss because the people who then work for it will not have their jobs. So therefore the team has to make a profit, has to make money for that team or that club to survive. Look at Bury as an example of a team who did not survive because they did not have the fan base necessarily, although what fans they did have were highly vocal, and if you like, they are the ultras, and therefore could not compete within the greater Manchester area. As a manager, if I don't provide this, then I will get the sack. And I'm more likely to get the sack as a manager than the football players are, because they are an investment. At international level, you can't sack the players, you just say you're not playing. Because they're not necessarily on central contracts, although some teams do now have a central contract system in order to make sure that they have their players at certain times. Thanks to the G12 teams, they've enabled those players who play internationally to effectively get paid, or shall I say compensated. Most teams want their stadium to be a fortress, like we saw with Northern Ireland versus the Republic of Ireland. But there is a difference. in terms of a hostile atmosphere that can help to increase performance of your players. But there's a difference between a healthy atmosphere and an unhealthy one.
The tension that we felt about going up to Belfast was nothing compared to what we felt when we got to Belfast.
We had an armoured car in front of us and an armoured car behind us as our bus made its way through. We passed a bank. They didn't have rifles, but they were all like that, boom! And they all went down on one knee, and another group stood up behind them, and boom! I'd say the eldest child was about 12.
It was nasty. It was unhealthy.
They didn't play our anthem, we had no fans in the stadium, and we knew if we lost, we were out.
And I personally think when the Republic of Ireland played in Northern Ireland, that this was an unhealthy atmosphere potentially for the players, but they showed their resilience and they were able to win that game. But the reason why it probably was an unhealthy atmosphere was due to the complex history and politics of Ireland itself. With it being funded by the Alzheimer societies of both England and Ireland, there was also a look into Alzheimer's itself and the possible effect of heading on with soccer players and its effect upon dementia in later life.
The latest research covered footballers from Jack's era, and it found that players were 3 to 5 times more likely to suffer from dementia. The trauma from heading has been linked to decline in brain function.
Here's a picture of the famous team from '66. Now, sadly, 4 of these men now have issues with their memory. We've got Martin Peters and Nobby Stiles, who have Alzheimer's. So too Ray Wilson and Big Jack Charlton, the defender. Unfortunately, he has problems remembering some of the games he played in.
It is a shame that this has happened to the England's 1966 World Cup winning squad. Balls in those days were ridiculously heavy.
This ball here is a replica of the one used in the '66 World Cup final. Now, the players of the day say heading a ball like this, a heavy leather ball when it was waterlogged, was like headbutting a brick.
Some of the footballs that were used years ago were beasts. That's all you can order, like cannonballs, and when they got wet, they were pretty nasty.
One of the very first modern day research looking into heading and its potential effects upon dementia has shown that there is an effect upon the brain. Although they did head the ball over 20 times, and therefore this is a limitation, as this is unrealistic to actual practice and game day. Yet again, this is realistic to the practice they would have had back in those days. Sir Geoff Hurst stated that heading training sessions back in the day required them to head a ball upon a string as for a warm-up in the gym. They then would go out onto the field and they would practice doing head tennis, head volleyball, then they'll go and practice defensive headers, attacking headers, and then finally they would finish off with corners.
Spoke to Willie Stewart, who's a professor at Glasgow University, and he told me that if you had 2 squads of 22, in other words 44 players, you might get 1 person. That should be the average. And the odds of this happening are astronomical.
They say some players may well have CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, something more commonly associated with boxers.
It's a brain disorder that is caused by a long period or a career, if you will, of damage to the brain, typically from sport. The challenge here is that the signs and the symptoms of dementia are very similar to the signs and symptoms of CTE. And the only proper diagnosis of CTE with present technology is postmortem.
Still needs to be more research in this area, as our current understanding is lacking, especially around what I like to call 2nd and 3rd generation footballs, especially as 3rd generation footballs can leave the foot at over 100 miles per hour.
Me home I started, left the girls at Schumann, nearly broken heart, saluted father dear.
The use of music was interesting. They tried to keep it relevant to the island itself by having all these Irish folk songs being played. Sound of the Irish rover, what am I going to say? I've got my notepad over there, but I can't remember what I'm going to say. Hey, hey. Personally, I like the Irish folk songs, but they only generally get played oddly enough at Christmas or when someone dies.
Even I got up and sang a song.
Oh, lads, you should have seen them cannon, passing the folks along the road just as they were standing.
What the documentary filmmaker was keen on doing was trying to keep a somber tone throughout. There were parts where they were showing that the team singing the Beatles and Irish folk songs.
Hey Jack, don't be afraid. You are made to go out and get there. The minute you made the Irish your side to make us
This didn't feel like a depart from the actual tone of the documentary. It kept that somber tone, it kept that reflective tone. One for the deli, oh there's whiskey in the jar. Oh, I've got the song stuck in my head now. Nostalgic is probably the wrong term to use, but it had a certain sense of nostalgia about it, but also a certain sense of being upsetting.
The interesting use of B-roll, aka filming inanimate objects, helped to tell the story. It kept the tone of the documentary. This demonstrates to the viewer what you might expect. For instance, this goal, rusty goal, in a field of flowers helps to tell that story, which is important in a documentary where there is little to no narration. They also recreated some of their own scenes like they do in some modern day documentaries to highlight stories that may or may not have been recorded. It was a shame we didn't actually get the modern day interviews with Jack Charlton, although due to his Alzheimer's this would not have been possible and probably not have been fair.
What is this, a bloody lawnmower convention or what?
We also saw the build-up of Jack's personality, the storyline about how he came to where he was, although this was not in massive detail one bit. And this is probably because there was a massive focus upon the Irish football team and a slight focus upon him having Alzheimer's, although in my opinion they should have focused on one or the other. Finding Jack Charlton covers the managing career of Charlton, who took over the Republic of Ireland national football team in 1986 and became one of the most beloved residents of that country. Although the film director initially planned to make the film about Charlton's importance in Ireland, they realised upon visiting him that Charlton's dementia was too advanced to be able to speak about the past. The filmmaker thus shifted halfway through the focus to include Charlton's last years and the impact on dementia on him and his family. This film was partly funded for by charities relating to Alzheimer's in both England and Ireland. This is where the major problem lies with this documentary, not because he's highlighting Alzheimer's or just highlighting Ireland. It's the fact that there is no real true focus on the film. Usually with documentaries they'll cover the whole entire life, or they'll cover a facet of their life in such great detail. This did not do this, and therefore the Alzheimer's side of the actual film actually suffered a lot from having not much details about it. They could have done a lot better if they just made this into two documentaries. One about living with Alzheimer's and focused heavily upon it and the information relating to it, and one about him as a manager of Ireland. Because when you're making content, you would often focus from a lack of information. There's not enough time really to make a film and to put everything you want in that one film, all of what you want in that small time. It doesn't matter how long the film actually is. Something will go, something will missing, and in this case, quite a lot of the information was missing. Nonetheless, these chapters are poignantly juxtapositioned with Charlton's later life. And of course, he died late in July this year, the year of this film's release. It's very emotional and intimate scenes, especially the cheerful, unsentimental interviews with his wife, movingly captured.
I've been a wild rover. What's football about? You're at Wembley Stadium and a ball is crossed from the right wing and you go boom, boom.
If this is a swan song to his managerial career, then this is a fitting tribute. However, I would have liked to have known more about his managerial career on a domestic basis, not just on an international basis. This is true of his younger life as well. The B-roll or overlay, including the music, is
You couldn't feel the spirit
unique.
of the camp.
If this was any other documentary, the utilisation of the rather bluey style colour they utilised over the filters, the B-roll they utilised, how it seemingly did not fit combined with the music wouldn't make sense. However, in this documentary it did. It highlighted the Irish ancestry, the Irish roots and the Irish ways of Jack Charlton and the Irish football team, as well as highlighting where he came from and how hard it was where he came from. It helped to keep that somber tone also. All in all, I give Finding Jackie Charlton a KSA score of 90.98.
That he had terrible, rotten, stinking bad. She had terrible, terrible bad breath. He said, now, I want to tell you, Missy. He said, but before I do, I want to go in the bath. Took his shoes off, took his socks off, threw them in the bath. And he came out. He said, before you do, let me go in the bathroom. Mouthwash, gargle, clean the teeth. He came out and said, now, I want to tell you my secret. I know what it is. You've let me so.